Scarred cowboys love the deepest, said the Prairie woman after he bled for her all night. The bullet was still in me when she said it. Not moving, not doing anything particularly useful in there, just sitting in the meat below my left shoulder, about 3 inches south of where it would have mattered, which is the only reason I was still breathing to hear her say it at all. She'd been up the whole night. I knew that without having to ask. I could track her by sound, the scrape of the pot against the iron, the wet pull of cloth off a wound and back on again, the flint and spark of the lamp when it guttered out around 2 in the morning. I drifted some, came back hard when she pressed, drifted again, but her sounds never stopped, not once through the whole long dark. It was barely first light when she said it, just barely. The sky through the window frame, one of those small square windows that face east, was the color of creek water in autumn. Not light yet, not dark anymore. And she was sitting on the low stool she'd dragged from beside the door, and she had her hands in her lap, and she was looking at me the way you look at something you're not sure you still have. Scarred cowboys love the deepest, she said. I figured that out last night. Then she looked away out the window. I didn't say anything back. Couldn't have told you what to say. That's the trouble, you wait your whole life for a woman to say something like that, and when it comes you just lie there in a borrowed bunk with a bullet in you and your mouth dry as chalk. My name is Calvert Drew. I'm going to tell this right, which means I have to back up some, because there's no way to understand what she said or why it leveled me like it did unless you know what came before it. Unless you know what I was, and what the last 20 years had made of me, and how a man can get to a place where a woman sleeping in the same house feels like something borrowed that someone is about to come take back. I grew up in Missouri, in the river bottom country below Hannibal. Good farmland when it wasn't flooded, which it always was. My father raised tobacco and corn and lost both about every 3rd year to the river, and then he'd drink through the winter and be sober by spring and go back to it. That was the shape of him. I don't hold it against him now. I did for a long time, but you get to a certain age, and you start to see your father as just a man who got beat down by circumstances, same as any man does. I left at 17, took a horse I half-owned and a knife I fully owned and went west. This was after the war, not the big one, I'm too young for that, but the border trouble, the raids, the way the whole state of Missouri felt like it was still fighting something even after everyone had agreed to stop. You could feel it in a room. 2 men who'd never met, you could still feel it. I hired on with a cattle outfit out of Texas when I was 19. I won't say the name of the outfit because the man who ran it is likely still running something somewhere, and what he did doesn't need advertising. What I'll say is I worked for him for 3 years and I was good at it, better than good, and at the end of the 3 years, he paid me about 2/3 of what he owed me, and told me I was lucky to have gotten that much. And I was young enough and angry enough that I said something back, which is how I got this scar. The one that runs from my jaw down to the side of my neck. You've probably noticed it. Most people do, though they try not to let on. Children stare at it openly, which I respect more. It's from a quirt handle, since you're wondering. He had a heavy silver fitting on the end of his. I learned something about men that day that took me a long time to unlearn, that some men mistake being powerful for being right, and they will work very hard to make sure you never get to point out the difference. After that I drifted. That's the honest word for it. I worked roundups. I scouted some for the Army, though I'm not proud of everything that went with that, and I'll get to it because it matters to the story. I did a winter of trapping up in Wyoming territory. I punched cattle in Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado. I was good with horses and I was good at reading country, and I could read men about as well, which kept me alive a number of times when being good with horses wouldn't have been enough. I turned 40 in a line shack on the Cimarron. Alone, which was by then more or less the permanent condition. Not because I wanted to be alone, but because somewhere in all that drifting a thing had happened to me that I couldn't name and didn't know how to fix, which was that I had gotten so used to being looked through that I'd started to believe that was all there was to see. You know what I mean. Maybe you felt it. You walk into a room and nobody turns. You do good work and the man you did it for nods once and moves on to the next thing. You pull a fellow out of a bad spot and he remembers the spot but not who pulled him. It accumulates. It's not any one thing. It's 100 things over 20 years. And then one day you realize you've stopped expecting anything different. And that's the worst part, not the being overlooked, but the having given up on minding. I'd had a woman once. Her name was Clara and she was a school teacher in Dodge City and she was the smartest person I'd ever met. And she was good to me for about 8 months before she realized that a man who disappears twice a year on cattle drives is not going to build a life she could stand to live in. She wasn't wrong. She married a hardware merchant and I hear she's still in Dodge and I hope she's happy. I do. That's not a bitter thing to say, I mean it plain. But after Clara, there wasn't anyone. And after a while the not anyone got to feel like the natural order of things. The way a healed-over wound stops hurting, and you forget what it felt like before it was scarred. The scout work is the part I said I'd come back to. I was 36 when I took a contract with a cavalry post out of the Dakotas. It was late in the Indian campaigns, late enough that I should have known better. The writing was on every wall if you were looking. The government was going to get what it wanted, same as it always did, and the getting was going to be ugly in ways that a man on the payroll was going to have to decide about. The officer I reported to was a young captain named Alderman. He was from Ohio and had good manners and believed in what he was doing with the kind of clean certainty that only comes from having never been wrong about anything important. He wasn't cruel. He was just sure, which can end up worse. I scouted for him for 2 seasons. I found water. I found passes. I found camp sites and told him which ones were safe and which ones weren't. I told him things about the country that he couldn't have found without me, and he used what I told him the way men like him always use what they're given without ever quite acknowledging where it came from. In the 2nd season, there was an incident that I won't describe in detail, because it wasn't something that benefits from detail. I'll say that I rode out ahead to a village that the captain had orders for, and that what I found when I got there was not what the captain's intelligence had told him he'd find, and that I rode back and told him this clearly and that he chose not to adjust his orders. I could have quit. I should have quit. I didn't quit, and that is something I have worked out with myself in the years since, quietly, in the way that things get worked out when there's no one else to work them out with. What I got from it, aside from that particular weight on a man's chest, was that I left the scout work after that winter and didn't go back to it. And I developed, I don't know how else to say this, a particular sympathy for people who were being used by the same machinery that had used me, even if their circumstances were different from mine, even if they were people I hadn't been raised to see as people. Took me longer to get there than it should have, but I got there. I was 42 when I came to the Powder River country. This was 5 years before the night I'm telling you about. I'd hired on with a rancher named Guttridge who ran cattle on a big stretch of grass along the river. He was a fair man, paid what he said he'd pay, didn't ask for more than a man could give, left you alone to do the work. That's about as much as you can ask for. I ran his line on the North Range, which put me in a small house about 6 miles from the main compound. Stone chimney, sod walls, plank floor, 1 window. It suited me. In the mornings I could see 30 miles of prairie from the rise behind the house, and in the evenings the light came through that window and lay across the floor like it meant something, and I'd sit in it after supper and sometimes not think about anything at all, which was as close to peace as I'd gotten in a long time. The Teague family had a homestead 3 miles north of me. I knew them by sight before I knew them by name. Father, mother, 2 boys, and a daughter. The father was a hard-working man who was trying to do what 500,000 other men had tried to do on the plains, which was raise food out of ground that the plains were not particularly interested in growing food on. He'd sod-busted a stretch of bottomland along a creek and was growing corn and wheat and losing about what you'd expect. He was stubborn about it, which I respected, Even knowing stubborn and right are not the same thing. The daughter was named Nessa. I won't spend a lot of time describing her because I'm not good at it, and the details I could give you would be the wrong ones anyway. What I'll say is she was tall, with dark hair gone a little red in the summer sun, and she had the kind of face that doesn't require any particular light to look good in. She'd grown up on the frontier, which means she could ride and shoot and skin a deer, and set a broken bone, and didn't flinch at things that would have sent a town woman running. She was 31. I was 42. I'm not going to pretend that didn't sit in the back of my mind because it did. I helped the family where I could without making it feel like charity, which is a line a man has to walk carefully. I fixed a section of their fence that had gone over in the spring floods. I pulled their wagon out of a wash it had gotten stuck in. Once when the father was laid up with a bad back, I spent 2 days helping get the corn in before the weather turned. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because good neighbors on the prairie are worth more than almost anything else you can name. I didn't do it to get anything. But I noticed her. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. There was a Sunday in the first autumn when I was at the Teague place for supper, and after we ate she came out and sat on the step beside me while the light went down, and we didn't talk much but we were comfortable not talking, which is a thing you can't force, and is rarer than most people know. I rode home that evening thinking the thing that a man like me thinks, which is, don't. You know how this ends. You're not the kind of man a woman stays for. You drift. You disappear. You carry things you've never found a way to put down, and a woman like that deserves better than to take on someone else's load. So I was careful, friendly but careful, useful but at a distance. I told myself it was for her good. Her father died in the second winter. Pneumonia. He'd been weak in the lungs for years. You could hear it in his chest when he talked, that particular rattle, and the winter came in hard that year and it took him in January. I helped dig the grave in frozen ground, which is as hard a job as there is. The 2 boys were 13 and 15. The mother was a steady woman, but she'd been steady for 20 years next to a man who was the other half of her, and you could see what losing him had done not broke her, but changed her, the way a tree changes when you cut a limb off. Still standing but leaning different. Nessa held the family together that winter. I watched her do it from a respectful distance, keeping the boys at their chores, keeping the mother from folding into herself, stretching the provisions further than they should have gone. She was matter-of-fact about it the way capable people are, not dramatic, just doing the next thing. In the spring I started riding over more. I told myself it was because the family needed the help. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth. By summer I was eating Sunday supper with them most weeks. By fall I was helping Nessa manage the accounts, because her mother had never learned letters well and the boys weren't there yet. We'd sit at the table after the others had gone to bed, the lamp turned low, and I'd go through the numbers with her, and she'd ask sharp questions and remember everything I told her and carry it forward. She was smarter about land and money than most men I'd met, smarter than I was in some ways. She had a sense of what a piece of ground was worth and what it could do and what it couldn't, and she wasn't romantic about it. That's the thing about people who have worked land their whole lives. They love it, but they don't lie to themselves about it. I don't know when exactly it happened. That's the truth. There wasn't a moment I can point to and say that's when I stopped being careful. It just accumulated the way things do, the same way the being overlooked had accumulated, but the opposite direction. What I know is that by the second spring after her father died, I was thinking about her every day. Not in a way I could have described to anyone, not with language that would have made sense out loud. Just a steady pull, like a compass finding north, not dramatic, just constant. I didn't say anything, still didn't. A man with my record, my history, my age, my silences, my scars, doesn't walk up to a woman like that and say what he's thinking. You keep your counsel. You do the work. You hope something shows through the doing that you couldn't say out loud anyway. The trouble started in August. There was a man named Hob who ran a small cattle operation east of the Teague place. He'd had his eye on their bottomland since before the father died, prime ground for his side, and the creek water that came with it. He'd approached the father twice while the father was alive and been told no both times, firmly. After the father died, he started approaching Nessa. She told me about it one evening in July, matter of fact, the way she told me most things. Hob had come to the house again, she said, had made an offer for the land, had said in the particular way men like him say things, that it would be hard going for a woman alone, that the boys would need money for a start in life, that the reasonable thing was to sell. I asked her what she'd told him. I told him no, she said. I said good. She looked at me a second. He didn't much like that. I expect he didn't. She looked back at the account spread on the table. He'll come back. He did come back. 3 more times through July and into August, and each time he came the offers got a little less like offers and a little more like something else. The last time she told me about it, a Wednesday evening, he'd brought 2 of his hands with him, which is a kind of language you don't need a dictionary for. I told her I'd speak to Hob. She said she didn't want me in it. I said I was already in it, which wasn't exactly my decision to make but felt true anyway. She thought about that. She had a way of going still when she was thinking about something, not absent, not distant, just going inward for a moment to look at a thing clearly. Then she said, all right, but just to talk. I said just to talk. I rode to Hob's place the next morning. He wasn't there. His foreman was, a broad-shouldered man with an easy look about him that I'd learned to be careful of. I told him I wanted to deliver a message to Hob, that the Teague place wasn't for sale, that the widow and her family had friends in the county who were paying attention, and that it would be better for everyone if the visit stopped. The foreman listened. He said he'd pass it along. I didn't believe he'd pass it along. But you do the decent thing and give a man the chance to be decent back, even when you don't expect him to take it. He didn't take it. Hob came to the Teague place 5 days later, on a Sunday afternoon. I was there, not by design. I'd ridden over to help Nessa's younger boy fix a section of the hayloft that had come loose. I was on the roof when Hob came into the yard. There were 3 men with him this time, and the way they fanned out when they dismounted was not the way men fan out when they're making a social call. I came down off the roof. What happened in the next few minutes is the kind of thing that's hard to tell in sequence, because sequences are for things that give you time to think. It went fast and loud, and then it was over. I won't make more of it than it was. There was a gun, then 2 guns. Then there wasn't any question of where this was going, and I put myself where I had to be, which was between Hob's men and the door where Nessa was standing. The shot caught me on the left side below the shoulder. I felt the impact before I heard it, which is usually how it works. I went down to one knee. I didn't fall all the way down, which I was proud of later and only then. Nessa's older boy, the 15-year-old, had Guttridge's old shotgun from inside, and when Hob saw it he made a calculation, and the calculation came out the way calculations tend to when they involve a shotgun at close range, and Hob and his men left. I got back to my feet. Nessa came out and looked at me in the way she had, that particular still look, and then she said, "Get inside." I got inside. What happened that night is the real story. The rest of it was just how we got there. She had some knowledge of medicine, the frontier kind, which is to say, the kind that comes from necessity and not from books. Her mother had it too. Prairie women either learned or they watched people die who didn't have to, and Nessa was not the kind of woman to watch something she could have stopped. The bullet was deep. Not deep enough to hit the lung, as best she could tell. I was breathing all right, ragged but all right, but deep enough that getting it out was a project. She was very calm about explaining this to me, which I appreciated. She said she'd taken a bullet out of her father's leg 5 years before, that this was higher and deeper but the same principle, that I was going to be fine, but it was going to hurt. I told her to go ahead. I'll tell you straight that it was the worst pain I'd experienced in my life, and I've experienced some. She worked efficiently and without flinching. Her hands didn't shake. She talked to me the whole time, not soothing talk, not the kind of talk you use to distract a frightened child, just steady talk, the same voice she used for everything, telling me what she was doing and what was next. At one point I reached out and grabbed the frame of the bunk and held on hard, and she paused for a second and put her free hand over my hand, firm, not soft, not babying me, just steady, like a person who knows you need anchoring. She got it out, put it in a tin cup. Then she packed the wound and tied it off and cleaned her hands in the basin and sat down on the stool she dragged from by the door, and she said, "Done." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Go to sleep." I tried. I drifted in and out. Every time I came back she was still there, tending the lamp, checking the bandage, once just sitting with her hands in her lap looking at nothing in particular. It gets cold in August in the Powder River country after midnight. She'd added wood to the stove, but not very much, and at some point I noticed she'd put her shawl around her shoulders. She hadn't gone to bed. She wasn't going to go to bed. I understood that without it being said. There are things a man learns about himself in the long dark when he can't do much but exist and be watched over. I lay there thinking about all the ways I'd talked myself out of things, all the careful distances I'd kept, the years I'd spent being competent at my work and useful to the people around me, and never once trusting that the competence and the usefulness were enough to make me worth knowing. I thought about what I was to her, not what I wanted to be, what I actually was. The man on the North Range who fixed fences and helped with accounts and sat on the step with her on Sunday evenings. A man with a scar on his neck and 20 years of drift behind him and no particular prospects. Not young, not easy. I thought, she's going to be here in the morning because she's a good person and good people don't leave a wounded man. That doesn't mean anything more than that. I fell asleep thinking it. I woke up when the sky through the east window went from black to that color I described, the creek water color, the between color. She was still there, on the stool. She'd slept a little, I think, sitting up, because her head had been on her chest when I first opened my eyes, and then she lifted it slowly, the way people do when they've been asleep in a bad position. She looked at me. I said, "How long?" She said, "About 8 hours. You bled some in the night, but it stopped." I looked at the bandage. She was right, there was seepage, but it had dried. She stood up and stretched, just a short, careful stretch, and then she looked out the window. The light was coming up slow. There was a meadowlark starting somewhere outside, and then another, and then the way they do, they just keep going. She said, "Scarred cowboys love the deepest. I figured that out last night." She looked out the window when she said it. I didn't say anything. I've told you about that. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and I was at least smart enough to know that much. After a minute she turned and looked at me. Not the checking look she'd been using all night, not the look of a woman assessing a wound. The other one, direct and clear and without any apology in it. She said, "You're staying on the North Range." I said, "That's right." She said, "Good." She turned to the stove and started building up the fire for breakfast, and that was that. No more said, but the way she'd said good and the look she'd had on her face when she said it, that was a woman saying she'd decided something. Not asking, not hoping, decided. I want to be honest about what that did to me, which is hard because I don't have words for it that don't sound like less than it was. I was 47 years old. I'd been passed over and looked through for so long that I'd accepted it as weather, just the climate I lived in, not worth arguing about. And here was this woman who'd sat up all night in the cold pulling a bullet out of me, who'd kept her hands steady and her voice level when anyone else would have been rattled, who knew every ugly truth about my life and the age on my face and the history I carried. She'd seen all of it, close up, at the worst possible time to see a man, and she decided. Not despite the scars. Not even alongside them. Something about the whole picture, scars included, was what she'd chosen. She said scarred cowboys love the deepest. I think what she meant, and I've thought about it enough that I feel entitled to offer an interpretation, is that a man who's been broken and healed and broken again, who's kept going anyway, who's learned to be useful and steady because those were the only currencies he had, who never had the luxury of giving up because he didn't have enough left to waste any of it. She meant that man has something in him that the untouched ones don't. The caring has nowhere else to go. It pools up. It goes deep. Maybe that's right. Maybe it's just something a kind woman said to a wounded man at first light. I don't know. What I know is it landed in me and found a place it fit. The rest took a while to sort out, the way things do. Hobb tried twice more, through channels rather than in person. There were lawyers involved, and some maneuvering with the county commissioner who was in his pocket. We pushed back. Guttridge backed us, which mattered because Guttridge was the largest landowner in the district, and when Guttridge told the county commissioner to leave the Teague place alone, the county commissioner did. The older boy, his name was Miles, grew into a good hand. He's running the North Range now, more or less. He's 22 and steady, and he has his father's stubbornness in the right direction. The younger one, Daniel, went east to school, which Nessa wanted for him and which was right. Her mother lived with us until she died in the 3rd year. Quietly, in her sleep, which is the death you'd pick for someone if you got to pick. Nessa and I married in the fall after the night I'm telling you about, in the same county office where her father had registered his land claim. There were 4 people present. It was exactly right. I'm not going to tell you the marriage has been simple because no marriage is, and lying about it doesn't serve anyone. 2 people with their own histories, their own silences, their own ways of being wrong about things. It's work. But it's the kind of work where you know what you're working toward, and that makes all the difference. She has never let me get away with the old habits. The making myself small, the careful distance, the assuming I'm not worth fighting for. When I do it now, she calls it what it is, plainly, without cruelty, and I have been called on it enough times that I do it less. That's a thing I didn't know you could learn at 47. That the machinery you built to protect yourself doesn't have to be permanent. That someone can see through it clearly enough for long enough that you start to see through it yourself. The scar on my neck is still there. There's a new one now lower on the left side, where the bullet went in. She knows the shape of it the way she knows the shape of most things practically, by touch, without fuss. On cold mornings it stiffens and I move a little careful until it loosens up, and she notices without saying anything and sometimes puts a hand there, quick, just for a second, and moves on. That's the warm kind of knowing, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. I am 52 years old. I run cattle on a stretch of grass along the Powder River. I have a woman beside me who chose me when she knew everything there was to know about the choosing, and who has never given me reason to doubt it. On good evenings, and there are more of them than I expected there to be, I sit on the step outside our door while the light goes down over the prairie, and I think about the man I was at 40, alone in the line shack on the Cimarron, who couldn't have imagined this. Who'd stopped imagining this? And I think what a thing it is, what a plain, enormous thing to be seen, to be chosen. To have a good woman look at everything you are, scars and silences and history and all of it, and say, good. The meadowlarks are going in the grass. The light is doing what it does. It's enough.